Hello, welcome to Can Do Teaching. This is Stacy Graff, and along with Amy Fournier, we'd like to welcome you to this episode of our podcast. This specific podcast is targeted towards our certified staff at Canterbury Elementary School, but could be a good listen for anyone.
Hi, thanks for joining us for this episode of Can Do Teaching. This is Amy Fournier, the assistant principal at Canterbury Elementary. Today, our topic is literacy, and we have a very special guest joining us today.
Elise Dean, the Director of Literacy and Social Science for District 47.
And this is Stacy Graff. I'm the principal here at Canterbury Elementary. Welcome.
So Stacy and I have recently started our learning walks through classrooms, and we've had a really good time getting these going. It's brought up a lot of questions between Stacy and I, and that's also brought up a lot of questions from staff. So we just wanted Elise to join us today to kind of clear up some of our questions. One of the things that we wanted to talk about first is kind of that loose and tight, the expectations that are really tight in the district, as well as the things that we can be more flexible about in the classroom. So Elise, can you talk a little bit about that first, please?
Absolutely. So as we're looking at the new units of study, the expectations really go around the progressions and the standards. As we talked about in the past, the standards and progressions were plotted out purposefully so that each grade level has a distinct learning path that grows over time. And so really making sure that each week you're aligned to the standard progressions that you're supposed to be teaching is key and critical. Mm-hmm. One big piece within that is that the mini lessons that are dictated in each week will help you get there. And so not skipping those is going to be really important too, because we all have to be on the same page and those connect and build over time. So you have a little bit of flexibility in regards to your students might need an additional day of reteaching, or you might have a text that runs a little bit longer than you thought. And that week 6 is where you can bump some of your instruction into in mono or in dual. You can make some adjustments there. But really making sure that you're teaching the standards and progressions, that's the tight component.
So Elise, when I looked at the resources, I was amazed because there's so much work that's been done, mm-hmm. but we're also very lucky to be resource rich. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes we get these resources that are published by a publisher. They're not unique to our district. And staff have questions about, well, these are provided to us. Do we need to use them as provided, or is there a rhyme and reason to how we use those? So for example, this time in our units, we have cards that came with many of the text, and it has all kinds of guidelines for lessons, different types of questions to ask. What about those cards is tight and what's loose?
Absolutely. So we know that publishing companies, when they provide us lesson plans, they typically give us 3 years worth of instruction in 1 year. There's always too much to cover over time. So at our training, we talked about using the lesson cards as a starting point along with the learning progressions for that week. And so when we're planning, we have out the lesson card and we have out our learning progressions for that week, and we kind of cross-check and decide which questions that are on the lesson card are going to meet the needs of the progression and our students in front of us, and which ones can we skip through because that's not our focus of the lesson. If you tried to follow the lesson card in its entirety, you would never get through a lesson in the 24 minutes that you need to get through. And so we have planning resources on the district website that will help you kind of tailor each lesson down to the amount of time you should have for each section. But then those learning progressions are always going to be your guide on what you select out of the lesson card.
Great. That's super helpful because I know people had questions. They'd see questions on the card that maybe didn't go with the progressions for that week, and they just weren't sure what their responsibilities were related to that.
Another really great resource that'll help with that, if you don't see a question on the lesson card, but you see a progression that you have to hit, those learning progression guides that were given to you, the flip books that have the standards tabs at the bottom, are a great place to start if you're looking for questions that tie to a standard but they're not on the card. That's a great resource for you to help you kind of plan.
One of the things that we've noticed is that when we're doing our learning walks, we see a lot of variety in anchor charts. And we just wondered if there's any guidance on that. Is there a rhyme and reason to doing it a certain way? What are your thoughts about that?
The reading mini lessons are all based on brain research and what we know about students and how they access things that we've taught them in the past is by being involved in it, right? It's not about these anchor charts looking Pinterest pretty or that we don't want to keep recreating them every year and laminate them. It's all about doing it with the students so that they can take the learning and apply it moving forward. So if we created a graphic organizer as one of our mini lessons, we want them to be able to create that themselves moving forward. And so each mini lesson is set up in a way that covers first you teach, and that's where you're facilitating conversations with students based on their experiences with the text. Then you go into have a try. That's where they're turning and talking and creating that understanding with a partner and then sharing out as a class. Then we go into summarize and apply. That's where we're labeling the strategy we used and putting it up at the top of the anchor chart. And then that share, that's that independent practice. If they read a biography, for example, or they're reading a biography, they go back and try what we just modeled in the classroom and then can bring it back to the guided table or some sort of spot to share the information. And so I think, when you think about the mini lessons and all of the anchor charts that you're creating, it's not about, you're going to be doing this every year and we have a million anchor charts. It's about making it so that students have access and that their voice is on the anchor charts and that they were a part of creating them so that they can remember what to do when they're reading a book independently.
I love that. And I love how you made that connection between either the guided table or their independent work and what they were doing in their lesson with the anchor chart. Talk to me a little bit about when you're doing whole group and you have a text that is pretty long. And we know we only have, 24 minutes scheduled for that whole group piece of our Reader's Workshop block. What does that look like when you have a really long text?
Absolutely. So, depending on the grade level, some of the texts do get really, really long. The committee tried their best to spread these out over time, but fifth grade is a perfect example where they had a chapter book and were asked to read 4 chapters. Obviously, that's something that has to be adjusted because we're hearing loud and clear through the feedback form that wasn't possible. And so when we're thinking about texts that are too long, we have to remember that we're teaching the standards and progressions. That's our type, that's our guide. We're not teaching the book. And so if I read all about penguins, my goal is not that students know every single detail about penguins and that I front-loaded every vocabulary word under the sun. My goal is that they could pick out the key details and identify the main idea of the whole text. And so if I didn't read every section in the book, that's okay. But I did get the strategy across and I covered the progression that they needed to know in order to move forward.
I think that's a really key tip, like a really important tip, because I remember when I was a teacher, that was really uncomfortable for me at first not to use the entire text. But what I really discovered is that when I used pieces of a text, it actually really hooked the students. And those texts were sometimes, if available, the most checked out books, whether it was my classroom library or the school library, because they wanted to see what was going to happen next. Or what more information they could find if it was a nonfiction. So once I got over the nervousness of not doing the whole text, that definitely made a difference. And I think that, I know we're not really talking about the writing block today, but it also applies to writing. Like if you're really focusing on the progressions, you might not write the entire piece all at once.
Yes, and you might not publish every piece, right? Like you might not make it all the way through the writing process with every piece, and that's okay too. Again, the progressions are the guide, and that's the tight. If students walk away understanding strategies and knowing and being able to do that part of the standard, that's key and critical.
One last question for you as we're picking your brain today about literacy. Coming up soon in our district is the kickoff for our guided reading groups. Do you have any tips or tricks or resources that might be good for our staff to reference right here before they get their groups up and running?
Absolutely. So as you're getting your groups up and running and you're trying to figure out where to start, these new resources that are in the building now from Fontes and Pinnell Classroom are amazing. They have a great starting point for book introductions, question stems to ask students, and things to look for. So starting with those texts is going to make things a lot easier for you. They also have the running record resources right there at your fingertips online, so that if you're not sure a kid is a level M, for example, I can put them in a group and I'm going to focus on the kids that I'm not sure first, or make a list of who's a little shaky and do a running record on them first. And then make adjustments as we go. Another thing to consider is that as you're getting your guided reading groups up and running, the stations don't have to be fancy. They shouldn't actually, right? We want it all to be connected. What they're working on in whole group should carry into small group and should carry into independent work. And all of our resources that are new this year have ideas for writing about reading that can become independent work potentially. Students can familiar read the books that they're reading in guided reading, and that can be a station or buddy read. There's all sorts of opportunities to set up your independent work to make sure that your guided reading groups are running smoothly.
So I know I said one last question, but I take it back because I have one last question. So one of the things that we talked about during literacy training, and that we have been noticing as we've done walkthroughs, is there's information about at the guided table, are students reading most of the time? Can you talk about why that's the guidance and what the importance is of that?
Absolutely. The more students read, the better they get, right? And if the book is a good text for that group, it's instructional. They should be above 90% accuracy in the primary grades, above 95% accuracy in the intermediate grades. And the piece that's so important to think about is that the more we talk at them, the less opportunity they have to problem solve and figure it out and use a strategy. And there's less opportunities for us to coach them. So for example, if I picked out every single word that they're not going to know about the topic and pre-teach that, then they don't have to use context clues or any word solving strategies along the way, right? Obviously, we do front load for students that are language learners and things like that, but it doesn't have to be every word in the book, right? Mm-hmm. It should be the ones that we anticipate are going to impact their comprehension the most. Mm-hmm. And so I think that when we think about the balance of teacher talk, keeping it short and sweet and giving them just what they need to be successful, but not too much to take over, right? It's what the students can do, not what the teacher can do. And putting that back into their court, right? And then sitting next to them and taking notes so that I know what to do for the next day. Maybe my book introduction was too small. Maybe they need a little bit more of that storyline, or maybe they need more vocabulary. But really using data to guide that so that you're not taking up too much time talking instead of having students reading.
I love that idea, because it's really hard sometimes to just be an observer, but we really need, I know one of my daughter's teachers once said, stick with the struggle. And mm-hmm. It's not that we want students to struggle to the point of frustration, but they need to come up against problems in their reading and have a strategy set that they can apply to resolve that.
And if they don't, then we know what to teach them next time, right? But you won't know that if you jump in too soon.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Elise, for joining us. This was a wonderful learning opportunity for us, and it's great that our teachers get to benefit from it as well. I'm sure we'll have you back for other episodes, so stay tuned, everyone. We'll pick Elise's brain in future episodes as well. Thank you again for joining us, everybody. We hope you got some good information out of this. Take care.